The rifle cracked once, and a man in field gray crumpled at the edge of the tree. 200 yards out, another soldier dropped flat, seeking cover that wasn't there. The bolt worked smooth and fast, ejecting brass that glinted in the cold morning light. Another shot. Another German went down. The orders had been clear. Fall back, regroup, abandon the position. But Private First Class William Colby wasn't falling back. He was dug into a shell crater on the forward slope of Hill 112, alone, watching an entire enemy platoon advance across open ground toward what they thought was an abandoned Allied line. They were wrong. And in the next 40 minutes, 37 of them would pay for that mistake with their lives. If this story moved your heart even once, subscribe. It's the least tribute we can give to men like him. This is the story of a single soldier who refused a direct order, held an impossible position, and bought enough time for a shattered defensive line to reorganize. It's about the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself, the kind that simply does what needs doing even when every rational voice screams to run. It's about William Colby, a farmhand from Nebraska who never wanted to be a hero, and the longest hour of his life on a French hillside in the summer of 1944. By August 1944, the Allied breakout from Normandy was gaining momentum, but the advance wasn't the clean arrows shown on maps in newspaper offices back home. It was a messy, brutal affair of small unit actions, confused communications, and German forces that refused to collapse despite being strategically doomed. Every mile was contested. Every village was a potential killing ground. And the Germans, professional soldiers with years of combat experience, made the Allies pay for every yard of French soil. Hill 112, located in the Calvados region southwest of Caen, had changed hands 3 times in as many weeks. It wasn't particularly high or strategically vital in itself, but overlooked a road junction that both sides needed control supply routes. The Americans had taken on August 7th after a brutal dawn assault that cost 2 platoons worth of casualties. They'd spent the next 2 days fortifying position, digging foxholes, establishing fields of fire, bringing up ammunition and supplies. William Colby arrived at Hill 112 on August 9th with a replacement squad attached to Baker Company, 115th Infantry Regiment, 29th Infantry Division. He was 22 years old, rail-thin, with hands calloused from years of working his father's farm outside of Lincoln. He'd been drafted in late 1942, trained at Camp Roberts in California, and shipped to England in March of 1944. He landed on Omaha Beach on June 8th, the day after D-Day, and had been in near constant combat ever since. He wasn't a natural soldier. He didn't have the swagger or confidence of men who'd grown up hunting or playing violent sports. He was quiet, methodical, the kind of person who thought before speaking and preferred action to words. But he had 2 qualities that made him valuable. He could shoot, and he didn't panic. The shooting came from years of hunting rabbits and coyotes on the Nebraska plains, where ammunition was expensive and every shot had to count. The calm came from somewhere deeper, some innate ability to slow down when chaos erupted around him, to focus on the immediate task rather than the overwhelming totality of danger. His rifle was an M1 Garand, the standard American infantry weapon, a semi-automatic that held 8 rounds in an internal magazine and ejected them with a distinctive metallic ping when empty. Colby had received a particular rifle in England and had spent hours familiarizing himself with it, adjusting the sights, learning its quirks. Every rifle was slightly different, and good shooters learned their weapon's personality. His pulled slightly left at ranges over 300 yards. The trigger had a bit of creep before the break. The gas system sometimes hiccuped with certain batches of ammunition. He knew all of it, compensated for it, treated the rifle like the precision instrument it was. On the morning of August 10th, the German counterattack came without warning. There was no preliminary artillery barrage, no probing patrol, just a sudden rush of infantry supported by 2 Panzer IV tanks emerging from the woods to the east. The Americans on Hill 112 were caught in the middle of breakfast, rifles stacked, men scattered among foxholes and improvised shelters. The first burst of machine gun fire killed 3 soldiers before anyone reacted. What followed was chaos. The German attack was well coordinated. 2 companies' worth of infantry advancing in short rushes, while the tanks provided covering fire. The American line, thinly held in surprise, began to buckle immediately. Lieutenant Morrison, the platoon commander, was hit in the first minute, a tank round exploding near his position and sending shrapnel through his chest and throat. The senior sergeant took a machine gun burst through both legs. Within 5 minutes, Baker Company's defensive position had disintegrated into a desperate fighting retreat. Colby had been cleaning his rifle when the attack began. He heard the shooting, grabbed his weapon and ammunition belt, and ran toward his assigned foxhole, only to find it already occupied by 2 other soldiers firing frantically at the advancing Germans. He looked around for orders, for leadership, for someone to tell him what to do. All he saw was men running, falling, screaming. The tanks were getting closer, their main guns methodically destroying defensive positions. Captain Hayes, the company commander, was trying to organize a withdrawal, shouting for squads to fall back in stages, to maintain fire discipline, to not break into a rout. But his voice was lost in the din of combat. Men were streaming back toward the reverse slope of the hill, some carrying wounded, others simply running for their lives. It was the kind of moment where units cease to exist as coherent fighting forces and dissolve into collections of terrified individuals trying to survive. Colby stood there for a handful of seconds, watching the collapse, and made a calculation. The German advance was fast, professional, unstoppable if it maintained momentum. But it was also exposed. The soldiers were crossing open ground, visible for hundreds of yards. The tanks were buttoned up, operating with limited visibility. If someone could slow them down, make them cautious, by even a few minutes, the Americans might be able to establish a new defensive line further back. He didn't think it through as a tactical analysis. He didn't weigh his chances of survival or consider the broader strategic implications. He simply saw what needed doing and decided to do it. Without telling anyone, without asking permission, he moved forward instead of back. He ran toward the sound of gunfire, toward the advancing enemy, while everyone else was running away. 50 yards ahead of the crumbling American line, there was a shell crater about 6 feet across and 3 feet deep, with a pile of shattered timber and sandbags on one side that provided additional cover. It offered a clear view of the German approach and concealment from direct observation. Colby slid into it, oriented himself, and began to work. The first shot was at a German officer, identifiable by his posture and the way other soldiers looked at him for direction. He was about 200 yards out, standing partially exposed behind a tree, gesturing toward the American positions. Colby centered the front sight post on the man's torso, let out half a breath, and squeezed. The Garand kicked against his shoulder. The officer went down like someone had cut his strings. The soldiers near him scattered. Suddenly realizing they were taking aim fire from a position they thought had been abandoned, Colby worked the rifle smooth and fast, the way he'd practiced 10,000 times on the farm and in training. Acquire target. Aim center mass. Control breathing. Squeeze. Follow through. Cycle the action. Next target. The M1 semi-automatic mechanism meant he could fire as fast as he could reacquire targets. 8 shots before the distinctive ping signaled an empty magazine. He dropped the first magazine in 6 seconds, hitting 3 Germans and forcing a dozen more to go to ground. He reloaded from the bandolier across his chest, slapping in a fresh 8-round clip, the action closing automatically with a satisfying chunk. The German advance had stalled. Soldiers were taking cover, confused about where the fire was coming from. An NCO was shouting orders. Try to identify the shooter's position. Colby shot him next. The man had been pointing directly at the shell crater, putting it together. Now he was down and the confusion intensified. Behind Colby, the American withdrawal was gaining some organization. Captain Hayes had managed to get about 40 men into a rough defensive line 200 yards back, using the reverse slope for cover. They were watching the German advance, expecting it to crest the hill any moment. Instead, they saw it stall. They saw Germans dropping, taking cover, the momentum bleeding away, and they heard the steady crack of an M1 Garand firing from somewhere forward their old positions. Hayes grabbed his binoculars and scanned the hillside. It took him a moment to spot the shell crater and the lone figure in it, methodically shooting at the German force. "Who the hell is that?" he said to no one in particular. Nobody knew. Nobody had been ordered to stay behind. Nobody had volunteered. Whoever had made the decision on their own and was now doing something either incredibly brave or incredibly suicidal, possibly both. Colby was aware of the Germans starting to focus fire on his position. Bullets were cracking overhead, impacting the dirt around the crater, chewing into the timber and sandbags. But the crater was good cover, and the Germans didn't have a perfect fix on his location. They were shooting at movement, at muzzle flash, at the general area. As long as he stayed low between shots and varied his position slightly within the crater, he had a chance. The tanks were the real problem. One of them was traversing its turret, trying to bring the main gun to bear. Colby knew that if it got a shot off, the crater would become his grave. He aimed carefully at the tank's vision ports, the narrow slits through which the crew observed the battlefield. It was a desperation shot, low probability of effect, but he took it anyway. The bullet sparked off the tank's armor. No penetration, but the tank commander, already nervous about advancing without infantry support, decided to pull back slightly. Small victories. Colby kept shooting. The second magazine emptied. He reloaded. A German machine gun team was setting up about 150 yards out, trying to establish suppressing fire. Colby shot the gunner before he could get the weapon mounted. The assistant gunner grabbed for the machine gun. Colby shot him too. The third man in the team grabbed his rifle and ran, abandoning the weapon. The German advance had completely stalled now. What had been a confident assault was turning into a cautious probe, then into a defensive posture. Officers were shouting orders. Soldiers were digging in where they'd stopped. The momentum was gone, and every minute they weren't advancing was a minute the Americans could use to reorganize, to bring up reserves, to prepare proper defense. Colby went through his third magazine, then his fourth. His shoulder was starting to ache from the rifle's recoil. His ears were ringing from the constant gunfire. The smell of burnt powder filled the crater. Spent brass littered the ground around him, dozens of empty casings glinting in the sun. He was thirsty, but his canteen was back at his original position. He was hot, but taking off his helmet or webbing would be foolish. He kept shooting. Behind him, Captain Hayes was on the radio to battalion headquarters, requesting artillery support, reporting the situation, and specifically mentioning the lone soldier who was holding up an entire German attack. Battalion was skeptical. One man, holding an enemy company. It sounded like exaggeration, like the kind of wild report that came in during confused actions. But Hayes insisted, and finally convinced him to send a forward observer to direct fire. The German commander, a veteran Hauptmann named Reinhardt, with 2 years of Eastern Front experience, was growing increasingly frustrated. His attack should have swept the Americans off the hill in 15 minutes. Instead, he'd been stalled for nearly half an hour, had taken significant casualties, and still didn't have a clear picture of what he was facing. The fire seemed to be coming from a single position, but was it a machine gun nest? A squad? Why weren't the Americans counterattacking if they had a strong forward position? He made a decision. He ordered a platoon to fix a defender in place with suppressing fire, while another platoon maneuvered around the flank. Standard infantry tactics. Isolate and destroy the obstacle, then resume the advance. It was sound doctrine. It should have worked. Colby saw the flanking movement begin. A group of Germans was moving right, using a fold in the ground for cover, trying to get an angle on his position. He shifted his aim, started engaging them. The range was longer now, over 250 yards, and moving targets were harder. But he'd hunted running jackrabbits at similar distances. He led the targets, compensated for wind, and started dropping men. The flanking attempt faltered, then stopped, then retreated to cover. The Garand pinged. Empty. Fifth magazine. Colby reloaded, his fingers moving automatically despite the fatigue creeping into his muscles. He did a quick count of his remaining ammunition. 6 more clips. 48 rounds. He'd started with 10 clips total, 80 rounds, standard combat load. He'd been shooting for maybe 35 minutes. Time was starting to blur. There was only the next target, the next shot. The immediate problem was staying alive long enough to take that shot. The German fire intensified. They brought up more machine guns, and now the crater was being swept with overlapping fields of fire. Colby had to stay pressed against the bottom of the hole, unable to rise up to shoot. Bullets churned the dirt above him. Timber splintered. Sandbags disintegrated. For several minutes, he couldn't do anything but endure, hoping nothing would find the angle to drop into the crater itself. Then American artillery arrived. Hayes had finally gotten through to fire support. The first rounds were spotting shots, landing 100 yards beyond the German positions. The forward observer corrected. The next salvo walked back, closer. Then the real barrage started. Dozens of shells, maybe hundreds, hammering the German positions with high explosive and shrapnel. The effect was immediate and devastating. The suppressing fire on Colby's crater stopped as Germans focused on survival rather than offense. Men were running, diving into any available cover, trying to escape the steel rain. Colby used the opportunity. He rose up, ignoring the risk, and started shooting again. Germans who were running, Germans who were frozen in panic, Germans who were trying to organize a withdrawal. He shot them all, not with hate, not with excitement, just with cold mechanical efficiency. Target, aim, fire, cycle, next target. The M1 was getting hot now, the barrel radiating heat, the wood stock warm against his cheek. His shoulder was going numb from recoil. He kept shooting. The German attack broke. It didn't retreat, in good order. It routed. Men were running back toward the tree line, abandoning equipment, carrying wounded when they could, and leaving them when they couldn't. The tanks reversed, backing away from the artillery, from the crater where one stubborn American refused to die, from the hill that had become a death trap. Within minutes, the battlefield was empty except for the dead, the wounded, and the wreckage. Colby fired his last shot, watched the German soldier stumble and fall, and then the rifle pinged empty for the 10th time. He was out of ammunition. He sat down in the crater, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. His hands were shaking. His heart was hammering. His throat was raw from breathing hard through his mouth. The adrenaline that had been sustaining him was draining away, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. He didn't know how long he sat there. Could have been 1 minute. Could have been 10. Time had lost meaning. Eventually, he heard voices calling from behind him. American voices. Someone was shouting his name, though he didn't know how they knew it. He tried to stand, found his legs weren't quite working right, and settled for climbing to his knees and waving an arm over the edge of the crater. Captain Hayes reached him first, sliding into the crater with 2 other soldiers. The captain stared at Colby like he was seeing something impossible, something that shouldn't exist. "Private Colby," he said. "Yes, sir." "Was that all you?" "That entire engagement." Colby looked around at the spent brass, at the empty clips, at his hands still wrapped around the Garand. "I guess so, sir." Hayes let out a breath that was half laugh, half something else. "You just held up an entire German company by yourself. Do you understand that? You were ordered to fall back." "Yes, sir. I know, sir." Colby's voice was hoarse. "But they were going to overrun us. Someone needed to slow them down. I was in a good position, so I did it." One of the other soldiers was staring out at the battlefield, counting bodies. "Jesus Christ. How many did you get?" Colby shook his head. "I don't know. I was just shooting. Didn't keep count." The body count came later, after the battlefield was secured and Graves' registration did their grim work. 37 German soldiers killed by rifle fire, all within a 40-minute period, all attributed to fire from the forward shell crater. Another dozen wounded seriously enough to require evacuation. Equipment abandoned. Attack broken. Strategic position held. The numbers were almost impossible to believe. Even trained snipers, operating in ideal conditions with specialized equipment and prepared positions, rarely achieve that level of efficiency. Colby had done it with a standard infantry rifle from an improvised position while under heavy fire from multiple directions. It was a kind of performance that occurred maybe once in an entire war, the kind that got written into training manuals and told to new recruits as example of what was possible under the right circumstances. But the right circumstances weren't about the crater or the rifle or the range to target. They were about William Colby himself, about the specific convergence of skills and temperament and choice that had put him in that place at that moment. He could shoot because he'd grown up hunting. He stayed calm because that was his nature. He chose to stay because he saw what needed doing and didn't overthink it. Remove any one of those factors, and the outcome changes completely. The immediate aftermath was confused. Battalion wanted to recommend Colby for a Medal of Honor. Captain Hayes wrote up a citation describing the action in detail, including testimony from multiple witnesses who'd observed the engagement from the reformed defensive line. But somewhere in the bureaucratic chain, the recommendation was downgraded to a Distinguished Service Cross, then to a Silver Star, and finally to a Bronze Star with V device for valor. The official justification for the downgrade was that Colby had technically disobeyed orders by not withdrawing when commanded. The fact that his disobedience had prevented a disaster didn't fully offset the breach of military discipline. The unofficial reality was that the Army was uncomfortable celebrating a soldier who'd ignored orders, even when those orders turned out to be wrong. It set a bad precedent. It suggested that individual judgment could override command authority. That was a door the institution didn't want to open. Colby received his Bronze Star in a brief ceremony 3 weeks later, presented by a colonel he'd never met and would never see again. There were no reporters, no photographers, just a quick formation, a medal pinned on, a handshake, and back to the war. He wrote a short letter home to his parents mentioning the medal, but not explaining what it was for. They received it 2 months later, along with a dozen other letters that had been held up by military mail delays. The war continued. Colby fought through France into Belgium and eventually into Germany itself. He was wounded once, a fragment from a mortar shell that tore through his calf muscle, but missed bone and major blood vessels. He recovered in a field hospital and returned to his unit. He participated in the crossing of the Rhine. He was present when his division liberated a concentration camp substation and saw things that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He survived the war and returned home to Nebraska in November 1945. He never talked about Hill 112. When other veterans gathered and told war stories, he stayed quiet. If asked directly, he'd say something vague about being in France and change the subject. He didn't feel like a hero. He'd done what needed doing, survived mostly through luck, and seen too many good men die to take pride in his own continued existence. The war for him was something to be endured and then set aside, not something to relive or celebrate. He married in 1947, took over his father's farm, and spent the next 40 years working the land. He and his wife had 3 children, all of whom grew up hearing almost nothing about their father's military service. He joined the local VFW post, but rarely attended meetings. He kept his medals in a drawer and forgot about them for years at a time. He was, by all accounts, a quiet, dependable man who worked hard, treated people fairly, and preferred his own company to crowds. The German perspective on Hill 112 emerged years later through historical research and prisoner interviews. Hauptmann Reinhardt, the company commander who led the attack, survived the war and returned to what became West Germany. In a 1979 interview with a military historian, he described the August 10th assault as the most frustrating engagement of his career. He'd had numerical superiority, tactical surprise, and armor support, and had still been stopped cold by what he initially thought was a well-positioned machine gun squad. When he learned, through post-war analysis, that it had been a single rifleman, he refused to believe it. Impossible, he said. One man cannot do what was done that day. I lost a third of my company. I had veteran soldiers, good men, pinned down and demoralized. One man cannot accomplish that. But one man had. The evidence was undeniable. The bodies, all killed by rifle fire. The American records, documenting Colby's position and actions. The testimony of witnesses. Reinhardt eventually accepted it, but with clear disbelief. It violated his understanding of how combat worked, of the relationship between firepower and effect, of what was possible within normal human parameters. William Colby had operated outside those parameters, not through superhuman ability, but through the perfect convergence of circumstance, skill, and decision. The tactical impact of the Hill 112 action extended beyond that single engagement. The German units in the sector became notably more cautious after August 10th, taking longer to organize attacks, probing more carefully, assuming every position might be more strongly held than it appeared. That caution slowed their operations, gave the Americans more time to consolidate gains, and contributed to the broader collapse of German resistance in the region. It's impossible to draw a direct line from Colby's 40 minutes in a shell crater to specific strategic outcomes, but the ripple effects were real. The story remained largely unknown outside of military historical circles until 1987, when a researcher compiling company-level histories of the 29th Infantry Division came across Captain Hayes's original Medal of Honor recommendation and the supporting documentation. The researcher contacted Colby, by then 65 years old and semi-retired, asking for an interview. Colby initially declined. When the researcher persisted, explaining that the story deserved to be told for historical purposes, Colby agreed to a single meeting. The interview was brief and uncomfortable. Colby answered questions in short, factual sentences. He confirmed the basic facts, added some details about his thought process and the physical experience of the engagement, but refused to characterize it as heroic or exceptional. "I did what I thought was right at the time," he said. "A lot of other men did a lot more and didn't make a home. I'm not special. I just got lucky." The researcher pressed. Didn't he feel pride in what he'd accomplished? Didn't he recognize the impact of his actions? Colby was quiet for a long time, then said, "I killed 37 men in less than an hour. Most of them never saw me. They were just doing their jobs, following orders, trying to survive like everyone else. I'm glad I stopped that attack. I'm glad my friends made it out. But I'm not proud of the killing. War doesn't work that way. There's no pride in it, just necessity and survival, and trying to live what you had to do." That perspective captures something essential about combat that often gets lost in heroic narratives. For the soldiers actually doing the fighting, war isn't about glory or noble sacrifice. It's about fear, exhaustion, moral compromise, and the grinding weight of violence. Acts of extraordinary courage emerge from that context, not as transcendent moments of human nobility, but as desperate responses to impossible situations. Colby didn't fight for an hour in that crater because he was brave. He fought because stopping meant letting his friends die, and that wasn't acceptable. The moral dimension is complicated. 37 men died because of Colby's shooting. They had families, hopes, lives they wanted to return to. They were conscripted into a war machine serving a genocidal ideology, but many of them were ordinary soldiers who might have preferred to be anywhere else. Colby's bullets didn't discriminate between committed Nazis and reluctant draftees. They killed based on proximity and visibility, mechanical determinants that had nothing to do with individual culpability. Colby carried that weight his entire life. In the rare moments he discussed the war, he always came back to the men he'd killed, not as abstractions or statistics, but as human beings whose lives he'd ended. He didn't rationalize it away by calling them enemies or by focusing on the strategic necessity. He simply acknowledged it as something he'd done, something he had to live with, something that would never be fully resolved or reconciled. That kind of moral seriousness is rare. It's easier to embrace simple narratives, to celebrate heroes and vilify enemies, to avoid the uncomfortable truths about what violence actually entails. But Colby refused that simplicity. He understood that being on the right side of war didn't erase the moral cost of killing. He understood that necessity wasn't absolution. He understood that living with what you've done is harder than doing it in the first place. William Colby died in 1996 at the age of 74. Complications from a stroke. His funeral was small, attended by family and a handful of friends. The local VFW Post sent a representative who presented his widow with a folded flag, one of his grandchildren. Curious about the medals found in his belongings, researched the Bronze Star and discovered the story behind it. That grandchild, now an adult with children of their own, has worked to preserve the story and ensure it isn't forgotten. The shell crater where Colby made a stand was long ago filled in, reclaimed by French farmers returning to work land that had been battlefield. There's no marker, no memorial, no indication that something extraordinary happened there. The hill itself is unremarkable, just another low rise in a landscape dotted with them. The only acknowledgement is in military records, in the dry language of after-action reports and casualty lists, in the documentation that proves it happened even though it seems impossible. The lesson, if there is one, isn't about individual heroism or exceptional skill. Those things mattered, but they aren't replicable. You can't train someone to be William Colby any more than you can train someone to have grown up hunting on the Nebraska plains or to possess his particular temperament. The lesson is about initiative and judgment and the willingness to make decisions under impossible pressure. The order to fall back was reasonable. The position was collapsing. Withdrawal was a sensible tactical choice. But Colby saw something the officers ordering withdrawal couldn't see from their positions, that the Germans were vulnerable, that slowing them was possible, that someone in the right place could make a difference. He made a judgment call that contradicted orders, and he was right. That kind of decentralized decision-making, where individual soldiers can assess situations and act on their own initiative, is something modern militaries claim to value but often struggle to actually implement. The tension between authority and autonomy is built into military structure. Orders must be followed for units to function coherently. But rigid adherence to orders can miss opportunities or lead to disaster. The balance is delicate and context-dependent, and there's no clean formula. What's clear is that William Colby found the right balance on Hill 112. He disobeyed an order because following it would have been worse than disobeying it. He made the call, executed it with skill and determination, and achieved an outcome that saved lives and altered tactical momentum. The institution gave him a medal, but never fully embraced what his actions implied about the limits of command authority. And Colby himself never claimed he'd done anything special, just what needed doing. That humility, combined with effectiveness, is the mark of genuine competence. People who are actually good at difficult things rarely brag about it. They understand how much luck was involved, how many things could have gone wrong, how fine the line is between success and failure. Colby knew he could have died in that crater. He knew 37 deaths was a grim tally, not a score to celebrate. He knew the only reason he was alive to tell the story was because bullets happened to miss him and German tactics happened to play into his strengths. In the decades since, military historians have analyzed the Hill 112 engagement in detail, breaking down fields of fire, sight lines, probable German movements, and American responses. The consensus is that Colby was operating at the absolute edge of what's possible for a single rifleman. The rate of fire, the accuracy at range, the ability to identify and engage priority targets while under stress, all of it represents peak performance under combat conditions. It's studied in military schools as an example of what individual initiative can accomplish, though always with the caveat that such performances are exceptional and not to be expected as standard. But exceptional doesn't mean impossible. Colby was an ordinary soldier from an ordinary background who found himself in an extraordinary situation and responded with skill and courage. The gap between ordinary and exceptional isn't as wide as we sometimes think. It's not about superhuman abilities or divine intervention. It's about preparation meeting opportunity, about having the right skills at the right moment, about making the hard choice to stay when every instinct screams to run. 37 men died on a French hillside in August 1944 because one American soldier decided an order was wrong and he was right. The fact that he was correct doesn't make disobedience a universal principle. The fact that he succeeded doesn't mean others should try the same thing. But it does mean that sometimes on the edge of chaos, individual judgment can see things that institutional authority cannot. Sometimes the soldier in the crater knows better than the captain 200 yards back. And sometimes the willingness to act on that knowledge, accepting the risk and responsibility, makes all the difference. That's the real story of Hill 112. Not a simple tale of heroism, but a complex one about judgment, skill, cost, and consequence. About a young man from Nebraska who spent 40 minutes doing something nearly impossible and then spent the rest of his life trying to forget it. About the 37 Germans who died not knowing who killed them or why they walked into a death trap. About the Americans who lived because one of their own decided to stay behind. About war, which creates situations where all choices are terrible and some are merely less terrible than others. William Colby made a choice. It was the right one. He paid for it with memories that haunted him for 50 years. The men he saved went on to fight other battles, to survive or not survive, to return home or end up in graves scattered across Europe. The Germans he killed became statistics, names on casualty lists, absences in families that never fully recovered. And the war continued, grinding forward with or without that single engagement, consuming millions more before it finally ended. But for 40 minutes on Hill 112, one man changed the outcome of one battle. In the vast scope of the Second World War, it was a microscopic event, utterly insignificant to the grand strategic picture. In the scope of the men whose lives it touched, it was everything. The distance between those two perspectives is the distance between history and experience, between the map and the territory, between what war looks like from outside and what it feels like from within. William Colby lived in that second space, the space of experience and immediacy and consequence. He never claimed to understand the bigger picture. He just did what he thought was right in the moment he was given. That's all any soldier can do. Sometimes it's enough. If you believe stories like this shouldn't vanish with time, subscribe. Let's keep their memory alive together. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from?